When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the world found itself standing amid ruins not only of cities and empires, but of belief. For more than 4 years, the human race had lived within an industrial storm that blurred the boundaries between civilization and savagery. The men who crawled out of the trenches and the civilians who emerged from blackout and hunger all faced the same question. What remained of the world they had once known? The First World War had ended, but peace was not a return. It was a beginning without a map. The war had destroyed much of the visible world. Towns, factories, railways, and homes. But it had also dissolved the invisible scaffolding of meaning that had held 19th-century life together. The old faith in progress, empire, and human reason had been shattered by the spectacle of mechanized slaughter. What followed was not simply reconstruction, but reinvention. An effort across continents to rebuild civilization from its foundations. The first task after 1918 was to confront the physical devastation. Across northern France and Belgium, the land resembled the surface of another planet. The fields of Flanders and the Somme were pitted with shell holes, littered with barbed wire, bones, and the detritus of armies. Entire villages had vanished. Roads led nowhere. Millions of unexploded shells lay buried beneath the soil, waiting to remind the living of the violence they had survived. In Verdun alone, 9 villages were declared dead, places too poisoned by metal and gas to be rebuilt. The countryside had become a graveyard of nations. Reconstruction began as an act of endurance rather than vision. France, whose northern regions had been the war's primary battlefield, faced the near-impossible task of rebuilding homes, railways, and industry amid economic exhaustion. The returning soldiers, many disfigured or traumatized, came home to towns that no longer existed, and to families impoverished by years of rationing. The generation of ruins, as some writers called them, worked with the stubborn patience of those who had seen too much to believe in miracles. Britain, though spared the physical destruction of its homeland, faced a moral and social rebuilding. The war had upended the class hierarchies that had defined Victorian life. The upper classes had lost their sons in disproportionate numbers, while the working class had gained political leverage through shared sacrifice. The Representation of the People Act of 1918 extended the right to vote to nearly all men and, for the first time, to many women. Democracy was expanding, even as confidence in political institutions waned. The nation that had entered the war as the symbol of empire emerged uncertain, anxious, and indebted. Germany's landscape of defeat was both physical and psychological. The war's end brought not triumph, but humiliation. The Allied blockade had starved the population, revolution swept through the cities, and the Kaiser fled into exile. The new Weimar Republic was born amid hunger, resentment, and the impossible burden of reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Streets filled with veterans wearing the Iron Cross on tattered coats, unable to find work or peace. Hyperinflation would soon turn savings into paper, and extremist movements began to whisper that the Republic itself was a betrayal. To rebuild after 1918 was to build in the shadow of loss. Every country carried its own wounds, but together they shared a new awareness that destruction could be industrialized, and that recovery could no longer rely on the old moral or imperial certainties. The war's end also redrew the political map. The collapse of the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires created a world of smaller, fragile states. In Central Europe, new nations emerged: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, each born with hope and insecurity. Borders were drawn by treaties rather than by consent, often slicing through ethnic, linguistic, and cultural communities. What was called self-determination in Paris became confusion on the ground. For these new nations, rebuilding meant invention. They had to construct identities as well as institutions, parliaments, schools, currencies, and armies. They inherited debts and disputes rather than stable foundations. Nationalism, once a rallying cry against empire, now became a source of division within states that contained minorities. The peace that followed the war was full of frontiers that could not hold. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire's collapse created a different kind of rebuilding, one orchestrated by distant powers. The British and French mandates in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine reconfigured the region under the guise of stewardship. The promises of independence made to Arab allies during the war were replaced by administrative control and partition. These new borders ignored geography and history alike, carving states from the desert with straight lines on maps. The war had ended, but imperial ambition had not. The struggle for self-determination in the Middle East was postponed, not resolved, and the wounds of that postponement would never fully close. In Asia, the end of the war brought both disappointment and awakening. Japan emerged as the only Asian victor at the Versailles Conference, securing former German possessions in the Pacific and parts of China. Its success signaled the rise of a non-Western power within a Eurocentric order. China, by contrast, felt betrayed. Having contributed labor and resources to the Allied cause, it expected the return of Shandong province, once held by Germany. Instead, it was handed to Japan. The result was the May 4th movement of 1919, a wave of protest that fused nationalism, anti-imperialism, and cultural reform. The students who marched in Beijing that year were not rebuilding from ruins, but from humiliation. They sought not only sovereignty, but renewal of spirit. India, too, found its awakening sharpened by the war's end. Over 1 million Indian soldiers had served in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, fighting under the British flag for a freedom they did not possess. When they returned, they encountered economic hardship and political repression. The post-war years brought new nationalist movements led by figures who understood that the rhetoric of liberty in Europe must also apply to Asia. The Amritsar massacre of 1919, where hundreds of unarmed Indians were killed by British troops, made clear that the empire's moral authority was exhausted. The rebuilding of India would not be measured in bricks or treaties, but in the slow construction of a movement that would one day end imperial rule altogether. The war had wrecked the economic machinery of the world. European treasuries were empty, trade routes disrupted, currencies unstable. The gold standard, once the foundation of global commerce, was suspended in chaos. Nations owed debts to one another and, above all, to the United States, which had emerged as the world's principal creditor. The old centers of wealth, London, Paris, Berlin, were displaced by a new financial geography. The 1920s began as a decade of improvisation. Reconstruction required loans, and loans required faith, a commodity in short supply. Germany, burdened by reparations, borrowed heavily from American banks. France and Britain, in turn, depended on those payments to repay their own debts. The entire system became a circle of obligation balanced on confidence. When that confidence faltered, as it would at the decade's end, the world's economy collapsed again. Yet for a brief period, the illusion of prosperity returned. Cities rebuilt themselves in steel and concrete. New technologies, automobiles, radios, electric lights, transformed daily life. Factories shifted from weapons to consumer goods, and modernity regained its glitter. But beneath the surface, inequality widened, and the trauma of war lingered in the subconscious of societies that tried too hard to forget. The economic boom was a form of denial, an attempt to cover the graves with neon. The war had also globalized industry and labor in new ways. Colonial economies were drawn deeper into dependency, supplying raw materials for European recovery. In Africa and Asia, new infrastructure, railways, ports, telegraphs, was built to serve imperial commerce, not local need. The promises of self-determination proclaimed in 1919 rarely extended to the colonies that had borne the burden of war. The rebuilding of Europe often meant the continued extraction of the world. If the physical and political rebuilding of the post-war world was visible, the psychological reconstruction was far less so. Millions of men returned from the front carrying wounds that could not be seen. The term shell shock entered the vocabulary, describing a trauma that defied medical explanation. Veterans struggled to resume lives interrupted by horror. Some withdrew into silence, others found solace in writing, painting, or political extremism. The war had produced a generation that could not believe in the myths that had sent it to die. Societies also struggled to find language for their grief. Memorials rose across Europe, obelisks, crosses, and statues inscribed with names that filled entire walls. Every town had its cenotaph, every family its absence. The silence of commemoration became the only eloquence possible. Religion offered consolation, but no explanation. The catastrophe had been too vast, too mechanized, too deliberate to fit into any older moral framework. In art and literature, the trauma of the war became a revolution. The modernist movement, fragmented, experimental, disillusioned, reflected the shattered consciousness of the age. Writers such as T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, and Erich Maria Remarque sought new forms to express a world without coherence. Painters turned to abstraction, sculptors to raw material. The modern world was no longer one of harmony, but of fracture. The very act of creating became a form of rebuilding, an attempt to impose order on chaos, even if only for a moment. Science, too, bore the war's imprint. The technological innovations that had killed millions now promised to rebuild the future. Airplanes for travel, radio for communication, chemical research for medicine. Yet the same intellect that had produced poison gas could not easily claim innocence. Humanity's relationship with progress was forever changed. Invention was no longer purely redemptive. The war had redefined gender as radically as it had redrawn borders. With millions of men at the front, women had entered factories, offices, and hospitals in unprecedented numbers. They drove ambulances, managed farms, and sustained families through rationing and loss. When peace came, many refused to return to the margins. The right to vote, granted in varying degrees across countries from 1918 onward, was both a reward and an acknowledgement of irreversible change. In Europe and North America, the post-war decade witnessed a cultural transformation. The image of the modern woman, independent, educated, urban, emerged from the ashes of Victorian domesticity. Fashion shortened its skirts, literature found new heroines, and society confronted the question of equality. Yet progress was uneven. Economic hardship pushed many women back into dependence, and conservative movements sought to reassert traditional values. Still, the war had shown that modern life could not function without the participation of women, and no amount of nostalgia could unlearn that fact. In colonial societies, the changes were subtler but significant. The visibility of women's labor during the war and the circulation of new ideas about freedom inspired early feminist movements in places like Egypt, India, and China. The rebuilding of the world included the slow reconfiguration of gender, though the pace of that rebuilding would vary across cultures and decades. The architects of the post-war order gathered at Versailles and Geneva with noble intentions and imperial blind spots. The League of Nations, conceived as a mechanism to prevent future wars, embodied both idealism and fragility. Its principles of collective security and arbitration represented a breakthrough in international cooperation, yet its structure was fatally flawed. Major powers refused to surrender sovereignty, and the absence of the United States, whose Senate rejected membership, crippled its authority from birth. The League's failure was not immediate but inevitable, for it relied on moral persuasion in a world still governed by force. The peace treaties themselves sowed the seeds of future conflict. Germany's humiliation, Italy's disappointment, and Japan's resentment combined with the economic turmoil of the 1920s to create conditions ripe for extremism. Fascism rose not from ideology alone, but from the despair of a world that had rebuilt its walls but not its soul. The democracies that survived did so precariously, haunted by unemployment, inflation, and fear of another collapse. The rebuilding of civilization after 1918 was therefore a work half complete. The world restored its buildings, its trade, and its governments, but not its trust. Beneath the surface of modernity lay an unease that would erupt again in 1939. The interval between wars was not peace, but intermission, a fragile pause in a story not yet finished. While Europe struggled with its own recovery, the rest of the world began to awaken politically. The rhetoric of self-determination, proclaimed by President Wilson, had reached every corner of the colonial world. Soldiers from Senegal, India, Egypt, and the Caribbean returned home with medals but without equality. The hypocrisy of empire had never been clearer. In Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, intellectuals and activists began to organize for independence. In Africa, the war had intensified economic exploitation, but also created new urban centers where ideas could circulate. Newspapers and political associations emerged, calling for reform and representation. The seeds of decolonization were being sown in the very soil that empires claimed to govern. In the Arab world, disappointment at the broken promises of wartime alliances gave rise to new national movements. In Turkey, the collapse of Ottoman authority led to the War of Independence under Mustafa Kemal, whose success in establishing a secular republic in 1923 symbolized both rupture and renewal. Across the global South, rebuilding meant not reconstructing the old order, but imagining a world in which sovereignty itself might be redefined. 8. Memory as reconstruction. Perhaps the most profound rebuilding after 1918 was the reconstruction of memory. The Great War became the first conflict to be memorialized on a global scale. Cemeteries, monuments, and annual ceremonies institutionalized remembrance. The minute of silence observed each November was itself a form of architecture, a structure built in time rather than space, uniting millions in collective mourning. This culture of memory shaped the 20th century. It created a language of loss that transcended nations. Yet it also risked sanctifying the very war it sought to mourn. Heroism and sacrifice became intertwined with nationalism, turning remembrance into both warning and weapon. The monuments of peace sometimes prepared the ground for new mobilizations. The human tendency to glorify suffering proved difficult to unlearn. Still, memory was essential to healing. The poets, painters, and composers who grappled with the war's aftermath gave the world not consolation, but understanding. Their works preserved the human truth that statistics could not express. The Great War, once called the War to End All Wars, became instead the war that forced humanity to see itself, and to recognize both its fragility and its endurance. By the end of the 1920s, the world appeared to have rebuilt itself. Cities glowed with electric light. Nations traded and celebrated. Young people danced to new rhythms. Yet beneath the surface, the echo of 1914 to 1918 persisted. It lived in the political anger of the defeated, in the pacifist literature of the survivors, in the silent nightmares of veterans, and in the unresolved contradictions of empire and race. The global balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The United States stood as the new economic center, Japan as a rising industrial empire, and Europe as a continent nursing its wounds. The colonial world was stirring. The very systems that had sustained imperialism, trade, technology, ideology, were now the tools of its undoing. Rebuilding after 1918 was, in the end, not a single act, but a process still unfinished. The modern world that followed, its democracies, its international institutions, its technologies and its anxieties, was born from that crucible. The silence that followed the guns did not signify peace but transformation. The world rebuilt after 1918 in stone, steel, and memory. It constructed cities from rubble, institutions from hope, and futures from grief. Yet every act of reconstruction carried the imprint of what had been lost. Civilization had not collapsed, but it had revealed its brittleness. The 20th century would inherit both the progress and the peril of that revelation. To rebuild a broken civilization is to accept that the fracture remains. The treaties, economies, and ideologies that followed the First World War tried to seal the cracks without understanding their depth. The real rebuilding happened quietly, in the hearts of individuals who learned to live with the unthinkable, in the communities that turned mourning into endurance, and in the nations that dared to imagine cooperation rather than conquest. The world after 1918 was neither healed nor whole, but it was alive, aware now of its mortality, and therefore capable of reflection. From the ruins of the Great War rose not certainty but consciousness. Humanity had entered the modern age not by triumph, but by survival. And in that survival lay the fragile foundation of everything that followed.